welcome to the channel. It's been quite a while since my last video about secondary statistics, and in my humble opinion, a lot, if not everything, has changed since then. That's why in this video, we're going to uncover entirely new facts that will help you understand how important or maybe unimportant certain stats of the game really are. The video will follow the iceberg format, meaning we'll start with the obvious things visible on the surface, and then gradually dive deeper into more hidden and less obvious layers of knowledge. We're diving all the way to the bottom, revealing secrets you won't find anywhere else. So make sure to watch the whole video. In this part of the video, we'll focus on common knowledge, mainly what the tool tips present, because most people base their understanding on that. And if your ego is telling you to skip this section, I'd recommend holding off, because I'm going to show you how tool tips can mislead you, even if you're a very experienced player. First and foremost, we need to start with a key stat, combat rating. For PvE, it's essentially a must-have. The penalty for having a lower combat rating than required is massive, making the content nearly unplayable. I don't think this needs much explanation. Everyone has experienced it firsthand. On the other hand, having more combat rating than required for PvE is disproportionately under-rewarded compared to the penalty. That's why I wouldn't focus on anything beyond a 1,000 point surplus. Things get interesting with combat rating in PvP, where the bonus is actually capped at just 10%. Unfortunately, it's not really possible to determine exactly how much of a combat rating difference between you and your opponent is needed to reach that cap, but take a look at the following differences. As you can see, a difference of just under 200 already gives you almost half of the total bonus, specifically around 4%. To get the full 10% damage increase, you'll need almost a 1,000 point gap. So when it comes to PvP, it might be worth considering whether investing into more combat rating is actually worth it. I think the rest of the video will help you make that decision. I've also come across a theory that the 10% bonus should actually be doubled. If you're dealing 10% more damage and your opponent is also taking 10% more, in theory, that should result in a 20% damage difference. However, in my opinion, when we're talking about a difference in combat rating, our potential 10% damage bonus is exactly the same 10% increased damage received by the opponent. So it's essentially just a single 10% bonus, or a penalty in the case of an opponent with a lower combat rating. To illustrate this, let's take a look at one of the tool tips and a small difference in combat rating. For easy calculations, both players have same 10,000 damage. And here's how the damage ratio changes for players with such a difference in combat rating. It's also worth noting that the bonus and damage reduction do not increase evenly. Both bonuses can be achieved at around a 1,300 combat rating difference. The exact values are shown on screen. And even though these percentages might not seem impressive at first glance, remember they're a multiplier to your total damage, which in the end can make a real difference. The next attributes we'll cover are the first directly opposing pair, armor and armor penetration. And here, based on the tool tips, it's really easy to overestimate both of these stats. Armor penetration is said to increase our critical damage by over 50%, while armor supposedly reduces all incoming damage and also increases the amount of blocked damage. So it's no surprise that a huge part of the player base associates these stats with massive potential for increasing outgoing damage and reducing incoming damage. I used to believe that myself, especially when it came to armor and its damage reduction, but for a slightly different reason. As for armor penetration, I had no doubt from the very beginning that only a small group of whales would actually be able to utilize this attribute effectively. Many players also fall into the trap of tooltips on legendary gems and essences, which clearly state that they reduce the opponent's armor. On one hand, you can't blame those players because the description should be self-explanatory. On the other hand, the actual mechanics behind how this armor reduction works show that it has nothing to do with the armor attribute and doesn't reduce it at all. So in these example essences, but also in any others, the description should state that a debuff is applied which increases damage or critical hit damage, but definitely not armor because it has nothing to do with the armor attribute. Although this is only the beginning of the rabbit hole related to armor and armor penetration, we'll return to this later in the video. The next pair of attributes is, of course, potency and resistance. I explained these stats in detail in one of my videos, and although the mechanics haven't changed much, in my opinion their utility has changed significantly. At the beginning of the game, it was indeed reasonable to associate potency with classes that had a significant number of crowd control skills. However, promoting this theory at this stage of the game is completely incorrect. Potency and resistance are opposing stats, and in theory, both are important for every class, which I will, of course, explain in more detail later in the video. And with that piece of information, we'll wrap up the surface level facts so we can dive a bit deeper and uncover things that aren't immediately obvious. Diving a bit deeper, we need to return to armor penetration, a stat practically loved by everyone. And here I'd like to draw your attention to the first line of the tooltip. Ignores some armor. So to understand what that really means, let's take a look at the description of armor itself. In the first line of the armor description, we learn that armor reduces all incoming damage. And since armor penetration ignores armor, we can assume that armor penetration increases your damage. In practice, however, this is yet another case where the tooltip is misleading because a general increase or reduction in damage for these attributes doesn't actually exist directly. However, considering that a portion of your attacks will be critical hits and some of incoming damage will be blocked, we can indirectly say that these attributes do affect your damage output and input, just not in the straightforward way the tooltips suggest. So to put it plainly, more armor penetration increases only your critical hit damage. More armor increases only the amount of damage blocked. If you have 0 block chance and 0 critical hit chance, then, with one exception, these attributes give you absolutely nothing. It's also interesting how extremely narrow the range is for this attribute's bonus. If you watch my channel, you'll surely remember the video where I showed detailed charts for potency and resistance, marking exactly how many attribute points you need to get the maximum benefit. I didn't make one for armor and armor penetration because such a chart has already existed for a long time. Over 3 years ago, a Reddit user named FewRub attempted to demonstrate certain relationships between armor and armor penetration, as well as their diminishing returns. Especially noteworthy is the last line, which shows the changes in overall damage. when increasing armor penetration by 100, 200, and 300 points above the opponent's armor. However, he did not specify for what critical hit chance values these results were calculated. As for the chart itself, similar to my one for potency and resistance, it's a bit outdated, and we need to add roughly 100 points to the old attribute values to achieve a similar percentage bonus. The sweet spot now is roughly 300 to 400 armor penetration over opponent armor, but in general, the user was definitely on the right track. However, I do have a few remarks about this, which I'll explain later in the video. And at this point, it's worth pausing to say something for free-to-play players or those who are only just starting to build their armor penetration. If you're mainly focusing on PvE, but not only, I'll now show you an interesting correlation between armor penetration and armor, which nobody will tell you. Considering that we're moving to Inferno 8, I'll base this on the stats from that difficulty level. At this difficulty level, the required value for each attribute is 3,761. Therefore, it's enough for your armor penetration to be about 400 points higher to gain over 40% additional critical damage. At this point, you can completely ignore armor because mobs don't deal critical hits nor block attacks. So investing in armor would potentially only increase your blocked damage value. The point is, if you invest in both armor and armor penetration at the same time, you probably won't reach a sufficient amount of either. And if you focus only on armor, you lose just about a 15 or so percent added to the base 50%. Since blocking in this game blocks 50% of the damage, and it guaranteed. For PvE content, this gain is so marginal that it really doesn't make any sense. The game is designed in a way that you need combat rating, not armor. Of course, you won't have 0 armor, it's just to emphasize how useless this stat is in PvE. Unless you have an extreme amount of block chance, but even then, there's nothing really to tank. And since you don't need armor, you can use all the sockets in your set items for sapphires. Over time, the effectiveness of regular gems has significantly decreased compared to items, so Fortitude plus Sapphire should allow you to achieve a sufficient amount of armor penetration required for PvE content. At this stage, you're probably wondering, what about potency and resistance? Can you still get a meaningful bonus if you're a low spender or free to play? And I can tell you right away the principles I applied to armor and armor penetration won't work for potency and resistance. First and foremost, you can't neglect resistance, because mobs use harmful effects that will have a significant impact on you. And contrary to popular opinion, at this stage of the game, literally every class needs potency, which I'll prove to you later in the video. For now, though, I'd like you to take another look at my chart. I've marked the sweet spot range for these attributes. Right now, that's a difference of about 600 to 1100. Compared to your opponent's values. So the first thing that stands out is that, unlike the previous attributes, potency and resistance work in both directions. You either get a bonus or a penalty if you don't have enough of them. What's more, these attributes have opposing diminishing returns. The reward for potency is greater than the penalty, while the penalty for lacking resistance is greater than the reward. Therefore, for players who are lacking in stats but want to be more effective in PvE, my solution is primarily willpower in every item, reaching at least similar resistance to your enemies at the given difficulty level, to avoid prolonged harmful effects, and if possible, investing in potency. At this point, I consider this the absolute minimum for you to actually benefit from these stats in PvE. Otherwise, you'll end up in the flattened part of the curve, where whether you have 0 or 2,000 will make virtually no difference. But I guarantee you, it's going to get even more interesting once we dive even deeper. I mentioned earlier that I have some issue with the armor penetration chart. While it is certainly accurate, in my opinion, it causes quite a lot of fear of missing out when it comes to potential increases in critical damage. A 50% damage bonus really does sound impressive, even by today's standards. But to better visualize how armor penetration works, I created my own chart. First, I'd like to discuss the situation where we have less armor penetration than the opponent's armor. In this case, we will not be penalized with lower critical hit damage, because the minimum value is set at 200%. So it won't matter whether you have 5,000 less penetration or just 100 less. Critical hit damage will always deal a guaranteed 200% of the normal damage. Once you start having more penetration, your critical hits can be boosted by an additional over 50%. However, pay attention how narrow the range is in which you actually receive this bonus. We will return to this topic when discussing PvP. The most effective bonus is within the range of 0 to 500. So if you want your penetration to work well in PvP, I would aim to have about 500 more penetration than your opponent's armor. The question is, how many players can realistically achieve that? I think only a small fraction of those at the very top. Also, take a look at the real proportion of the penetration bonus on my chart. I believe showing you this broader perspective might actually have the opposite effect of the on from original chart or tooltip. Also, keep in mind that the bonus from armor penetration is less than 1/6 of the total possible damage. I'm not saying it's nothing, but is it really worth spending a fortune on sapphires for it? At this point, we shouldn't forget about armor, something I used to strongly prefer. Since penetration directly interacts with the opponent's armor, this chart shows armor values in relation to penetration. So when armor is lower, the amount of damage reduced when blocked always remains at 50%. So in this case as well, it doesn't matter how much less armor you have, the 50% damage reduction on block is a guaranteed value. And of course, having just 500 less armor than your opponent's penetration automatically makes you take 40% more critical damage, but that results from what I mentioned earlier about penetration properties. However, if we increase our armor beyond the opponent's penetration, we will only take the guaranteed 200% damage when they land a critical hit, and we will reduce more than 50% of the damage when we block. It is simple like that. I used to strongly prefer stacking a large amount of armor and block chance, as it was the most effective way to reduce damage in PvP. But there is one major problem. Critical hits cannot be blocked. And since I made that video, we've received gems like Mother's Lament, Roiling Consequences, the Banquet of Eyes set, and the Essence for Critical Hits. What I mean is that the overall level of critical hit chance has drastically increased, and as a result, block efficiency has drastically decreased. And along with that, the armor attribute declined. Not to mention that the effective range for gaining bonuses from armor and armor penetration is so narrow that for about 80% of players, these stats are practically useless. When it comes to the exact value of armor and armor penetration you should use for PvP purposes, it's a very individual matter, and each case needs to be considered separately. However, I can show you a few statistical examples so you can better apply them to your own setup. So if you aspire to be a solid PvP player, in my opinion, you should always try to counter players stronger than yourself. I mean with higher numbers. Against players with lower stats, you should have no problem handling them. So first and foremost, you need to put in some effort and check what stats your opponents roughly have, and then decide whether to build yours accordingly or not. So let's imagine that on the other side, we have a whale who has roughly 7,000 armor, penetration and 7,000 armor. For most people, it's not an extraordinary situation. Fortunately, many whales build their stats evenly. On our side, we have players with the following stats. And now the question, whose attributes are the strongest against right-hand side player? The correct answer is nobody. Everyone's are virtually equally ineffective. This should be especially frustrating for the player who has 6,000 in these attributes, because it turns out they're taking just as much damage as player number 1. And yes, I know someone will say that a 1,000 difference is already a zone where stats slowly start to give some bonus, but the truth is, it's negligible. And even a difference of 500 less in the case of armor is simply a waste of money. As we know from previous parts of the video, armor penetration critical damage is at least 200%, even in the case of a huge deficit. Therefore, for each of the players, I removed 1,000 penetration to increase armor. For the first player, this will absolutely make no difference. If you're a new player, free to play, or simply have heavily neglected your secondary attributes, then your train has already left the station. For these attributes, you should mainly focus on having armor penetration for PvE gameplay. As for the second player, against the whales, this change still won't matter. Both attributes will remain equally ineffective. However, increasing armor to 5,500 will statistically cause a large portion of players not to deal him increased damage from critical hits. And someone might ask, why not increase penetration at the expense of armor? I believe that in cases of attribute deficits, a defensive stat like armor will prove much more efficient. But of course, that's up to you. And the most interesting is the third case, where penetration remains just as ineffective, but increasing armor equals the opponent's penetration. As a result, the third player completely negates the critical damage bonus that the whale previously had. So, referring back to the doubts about which attribute to increase, if the third player had chosen to increase penetration by 1,000 instead of armor, they would also equal the whale's armor, but that still wouldn't provide any benefit. Additionally, it's important to remember what was said earlier, that armor and armor penetration only provide an extra bonus on top of the base value. So maybe the community overvalues these attributes too much. So if armor and armor penetration aren't as effective as they might seem, then what is? The answer is quite unexpected, but very simple. It is, of course, potency. And here I know how many of you are upset with what I'm saying. After all, you don't use dots, you don't use crowd control. How dare I say something like that? Of course, potency works great on some crowd control effects and to prolong dots. But there's something else that many people forget about, even though it's hard for me to believe. I've long promoted increasing beneficial effects as one of the best stats in the game, especially with the current legendary gems. Now everyone understands that and recommends prolonging buffs. So why is it that no one seems to notice how insanely powerful it is to extend debuffs as well? Perhaps it's because for the training dummy, it's completely unnecessary, and I've noticed a huge trend that dummy is indicator of a good build. My approach is purely pragmatic. The solution needs to work primarily in actual practice, not just look impressive on a training dummy. But going back to debuffs, remember all the effects from first part of the video, which, according to their tooltip, reduce armor, but in practice are debuffs that increase damage. Over the past year, many such legendary essences have been added for every class, and extending the duration of these effects on your opponent is exactly what your potency does. Even if your build doesn't contain such effects, there's a very good chance you're using Roiling Consequence. Most people focus on the first bonus, which is, of course, great. It gives a huge amount of critical hit chance, and on top of that, you can extend its duration. However, the true power of this gem lies in its second bonus, because while the first bonus is active, your critical hit's reactive, burning effect, making the target even more vulnerable to critical hits. And even though the tooltip shows 3 seconds, in practice when you're constantly attacking the target it lasts at least 13 seconds, because it's a reactive effect. Something very similar to the third effect of Banquet of Eyes. Of course, we can extend this even further by using, for example, the Baron or Augment set. And of course, Potency. So this gem only allows us to keep the enemy burning for at least 15 seconds. Extending this burn is important because if your character has wind attacks, you'll get an additional 50% damage from Firestorm. And that's just one example. A very similar mechanic applies to one of the new gems, Blood Flow, great gem, and probably cheaper way to increase critical damage than stacking huge amount of armor penetration. There are really many examples like this, but with that being said, I think you already understand how much potency can actually change the game. Especially for you, I've also prepared update version of Potency Performance Chart. And the first thing to note is that the effective range for Potency is much wider than the narrow one for armor and penetration, and the ranges where the gains are negligible are still impossible to be capped. Most importantly, potency and resistance, unlike armor and penetration, clearly work in both directions. We get a noticeable bonus when our attributes are higher than the opponent's, and a clear penalty when our attributes are lower. The wider effective range also ensures that for most players, getting within the range will be possible, for example, at least to reduce the penalty. But it also has its downsides. So if you're going to buy every citron on the market, hold your horses for a bit. Potency definitely has many beneficial effects for virtually everyone. However, we need to go back to the armor and penetration example, where I explained why increasing penetration is not effective when you don't have attributes as high as your opponent's. The wider effective range for potency makes this even harder in this case. Now you probably wonder why I recommend potency then. Well, focusing on potency had a very important purpose. It was meant to make you realize how harmful an opponent with a large amount of potency can be, which directly shows how important your resistance is. I've also created an updated chart for resistance, but it's best to compare it side by side with potency. In my opinion, for PvP purposes, whether you should invest in potency does not depend on which class you play, but rather on how high you can raise this attribute while also maintaining a high level of resistance. But for the vast majority of players, investing evenly in both attributes will actually result in receiving an unsatisfying bonus from neither. As I mentioned earlier, for PvP, we should always aim at stronger players, so let's focus on the left side of the chart where our values are negative compared to the opponent. As you can see, in the case of negative values, the penalty for lacking resistance far outweighs the potency reduction. That's why you absolutely cannot afford to have a low resistance value. It's crucial. Even if you have to do it at the cost of drastically lowering your potency, I believe it's worth it, because a lack of potency can be compensated with two pieces of the Baron set. In the case of positive values, the situation reverses, and the benefits of potency become greater. However, in my opinion, you should aim for roughly 1,000 resistance points above the average potency of your opponent to maintain maximum defensive effectiveness. Which of course means that for the vast majority of players, there will no longer be room to have efficient amount of potency at the same time. But it's actually resistance, not armor, that should be your defensive priority in PvP. It will protect you from crowd control, which has always been obvious, but it will also significantly reduce the damage you take by shortening the duration of debuffs, even though this effect isn't immediately visible and doesn't work directly. It's resistance that, alongside the previously mentioned combat rating and your health from resonance, provides the greatest survivability. But resonance is a topic for a separate video. With all that being said, I hope this video highlighted which attributes are clearly overrated and which ones deserve much more attention, as well as shed some light on the matter for less experienced players. Remember, you all are the biggest support for this channel. And as always, thanks for watching.